1557, Spain controlled the world's largest silver mines, yet declared bankruptcy. 40 years later, they declared bankruptcy again, and again in 1607, 1627, 1647, and 1662. How does the richest empire in the world go bankrupt 5 times? If you want to see how the next empire fell apart, hit subscribe, because we're just getting started. Here's what makes this impossible to understand at first glance. Between 1503 and 1660, Spanish galleons transported 16,000 tons of silver from the Americas to Seville. That's roughly 200 million pesos in contemporary value, more precious metal than existed in all of Europe before Columbus sailed. By 1557, Philip II had to do something no king wanted to admit. He declared bankruptcy. Spain owed 6 million ducats to German and Italian bankers, and couldn't even cover the interest. The silver kept coming. The bankruptcies kept coming. For 105 years. This isn't a story about running out of money. It's a story about something far more dangerous and far more common than you think. Because Spain wasn't alone. The Ottoman Empire collapsed into debt crisis in 1875. France's debt spiral triggered the revolution in 1789. All 3 empires had the same thing in common. They crossed a specific threshold, and once they did, there was no way back. So what is that threshold? And why couldn't the richest empires in history escape it? Let me give you 3 numbers that explain everything. In 1559, 2 years after Spain's first bankruptcy, debt service consumed 68% of ordinary revenue. Not military spending, not administration, just interest payments on existing debt. By 1875, the Ottoman Empire was spending 50% of its entire budget on debt service, before paying a single soldier or building a single ship. And in 1788, 1 year before the French Revolution, debt service took 49% of royal revenue. Louis XVI's finance minister wrote in his diary, "We can no longer pay for both the debt and the state." Here's the pattern. When an empire hits 50%, when half its revenue goes to debt service, that's when things start to break. When debt service crosses half of revenue, empires enter what historians call the inescapable spiral. You're not funding an empire anymore. You're funding the interest on the money you borrowed to fund the empire. And here's what makes this so dangerous. The richer you are, the more you can borrow, which means the harder you fall. Spain had silver. The Ottomans controlled the trade routes between 3 continents. France was the most populous, agriculturally rich nation in Europe. All 3 went bankrupt anyway. So the real question isn't why they ran out of money. It's why they couldn't stop borrowing. And that's where this gets interesting. Over the next 12 minutes, we're going to trace 3 debt spirals, year by year, ducat by ducat, and show you the exact moment each empire crossed the point of no return. You'll see how Spain's wars created a trap. The more silver that flooded in from the Americas, the more they borrowed, and the deeper they sank. How the Ottomans went from 0 foreign debt in 1850 to losing control of their own finances in just 25 years. How France's decision to fund the American Revolution, arguably the most successful investment in liberty in history, destroyed the French monarchy. But more importantly, you'll see the mechanism, the pattern, the specific sequence of choices that turns sustainable debt into terminal crisis. Because by the end, you'll understand something most people never realize. Empires don't collapse because they're poor. They collapse because they're convinced they're too rich to fail. And we'll close with a question that should make everyone uncomfortable, because 3 empires couldn't answer it, and we're being asked to answer it right now. Stay with me. Let's start in 1556, the year Philip II inherited the Spanish throne. On paper, he inherited the most powerful empire since Rome. Spain controlled the Netherlands, southern Italy, Milan, the Philippines, and most of Central and South America. The silver mines at Potosi, in modern Bolivia, were producing 300 tons per year. Every year, treasure fleets arrived in Seville, carrying enough silver to mint millions of coins. Philip should have been the richest monarch in history. But here's what he actually inherited. 36 million ducats in debt, accumulated by his father Charles V, who spent 40 years fighting wars across Europe. Annual debt service, 1.8 million ducats. Annual revenue from the Americas, 2 million ducats. Here's where it gets interesting. Almost all the silver was already spent before it arrived, committed to interest payments on loans taken to fight the last war. And Philip had a new war to fight. France. Again. The Italian wars had been dragging on for 60 years, and Philip needed to fund armies in the Netherlands, Italy, and the Mediterranean simultaneously. So he did what every ruler in his position does. He borrowed more. The Fugger banking family in Augsburg, the Genoese bankers, anyone who would lend. Interest rates ranged from 12% to 18% annually, sometimes higher for emergency loans. And these weren't bonds you could default on quietly. These were personal loans to the crown, backed by future silver shipments, tax revenues, even the crown jewels. By 1557, Philip couldn't make the payments. On June 1st, he issued a decree suspending all debt payments and converting short-term loans into long-term bonds at lower interest, what we'd call a restructuring, but what his creditors called a betrayal. First, bankruptcy. The Spanish called it a decree of suspension, but the effect was the same. Spain's credit collapsed. Interest rates on new loans jumped to 30%. The Genoese bankers refused to lend for 2 years. And here's where the spiral begins, because Philip still needed to fight wars. So when the bankers finally returned, he borrowed again, at higher rates, which meant higher debt service, which meant he'd need to borrow even more next time. Between 1557 and 1607, Spanish debt tripled, from 36 million ducats to 112 million. Silver imports tripled too, but it didn't matter. Debt service grew faster than revenue, always. Second bankruptcy, 1575. Third bankruptcy, 1607, under Philip III. By now, the pattern is locked in. Spain borrows to fight. Fighting requires more borrowing. Debt service crowds out military spending. Weakness invites more threats. More threats require more borrowing. Fourth bankruptcy, 1627. Fifth bankruptcy, 1647. And here's the detail that should terrify anyone paying attention. Between the first and fifth bankruptcies, Spain received approximately 180 million pesos in American silver. That's not counting tax revenue from Europe, trade income, or anything else. Just silver. Where did it go? Debt service and war, almost exclusively. By 1664, historian Geoffrey Parker calculated that Spain was spending 9 million ducats per year on debt service alone, roughly 65% of ordinary revenue. The silver couldn't save them because the debt grew faster than the silver. And once you're in that spiral, there's no amount of revenue that helps, because creditors know you're desperate, so they charge more, which makes you more desperate. Spain's last bankruptcy came in 1662. By then, they'd lost the Netherlands, Portugal, and most of their military reputation. The empire didn't collapse overnight. It bled slowly, one interest payment at a time, over 105 years. But they weren't the first empire to learn this lesson, and they definitely weren't the last. Jump forward 2 centuries. Istanbul, 1854. The Ottoman Empire is about to make the same mistake, except they're going to do it faster. For most of its history, the Ottoman Empire avoided foreign debt entirely. Sultans financed wars through taxation, plunder, and debasement of the currency, but they didn't borrow from European banks. Islamic law prohibited interest, and besides, the Ottomans saw themselves as the creditor empire, not the debtor. That changed with the Crimean War. In 1854, the Ottomans joined Britain and France against Russia, a war fought on Ottoman territory to protect Ottoman interests. Except the Ottomans couldn't afford it. The army needed modernization, the navy needed ships, and European allies expected the Ottomans to fund their share. So for the first time in Ottoman history, Sultan Abdulmecid I authorized a foreign loan. 3 million pounds sterling from British and French banks at 6% interest. Remember that number, 3 million. In 1854, that was manageable, less than 10% of annual revenue. But the war lasted 3 years. And modernization costs more than anyone budgeted. By 1858, the Ottomans had borrowed 8 million more pounds, then another 5 million in 1860 for general budget shortfalls. By 1874, just 20 years after that first loan, total Ottoman debt reached 200 million pounds. Annual debt service, 11 million pounds. Annual revenue, £20 million, 55%. More than half the budget gone before the government could spend a single piastre on anything else. And here's where we return to that question from the beginning. How does the richest empire in the world go bankrupt? Because the Ottomans weren't poor. They controlled trade routes between Europe, Asia, and Africa. They had 35 million subjects. They produced grain, silk, cotton, and minerals. But they made the same mistake Spain made. They assumed they could always borrow more because they were too important to fail. European banks agreed, until suddenly they didn't. In 1875, the Ottoman government announced it could only pay half the scheduled debt service. Partial default. The European creditors, British, French, Austrian, Italian, and German banks, refused to accept the loss. So they did something Spain's creditors never could. They took over Ottoman finances directly. In 1881, the Ottoman Empire signed the Decree of Muharrem, creating the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, a European-controlled agency with the authority to collect taxes directly from Ottoman provinces and use the revenue to pay creditors. The OPDA took control of tobacco taxes, salt taxes, silk taxes, stamp duties, and alcohol revenues in several provinces. So what actually happens when the money runs out? The Ottoman Empire, one of the most powerful states in history, controllers of Mecca and Medina, heirs to Constantinople, no longer controlled its own tax collection in parts of its territory, and they stayed under European financial control until 1918. 37 years. The debt didn't destroy the empire overnight, but it did something worse. It turned the Ottomans into a supervised state, dependent on European approval for every major financial decision. That's what the debt spiral does at its endpoint. It doesn't just take your money, it takes your sovereignty. But wait, you might be thinking, Spain and the Ottomans were military empires, constantly at war. Surely a more stable, administratively sophisticated state could manage debt better. Let's talk about France. France in 1774 was the envy of Europe. Population, 28 million, twice that of Britain. Agricultural output, the highest on the continent. Paris was the cultural capital of the Western world. And when Louis XVI took the throne that year, he inherited a debt of 4 billion livres, large but manageable. Annual revenue, about 500 million livres. Debt service, roughly 180 million livres. That's 36%. High, but not catastrophic. Then came the American Revolution. In 1776, American envoys arrived in Paris asking for French support against Britain. Louis XVI's finance minister, Turgot, opposed intervention. He knew the finances couldn't handle another war. But Foreign Minister Vergennes argued that weakening Britain was worth any cost. Louis sided with Vergennes. Between 1776 and 1783, France spent 1.3 billion livres supporting American independence, roughly 2.5 times annual revenue. They didn't raise taxes to pay for it. They borrowed. By 1783, French debt reached 6 billion livres. By 1788, 8 billion livres. And debt service? 318 million livres per year, 49% of revenue. There's that number again, 50%. The threshold. Louis XVI knew the situation was terminal. Between 1783 and 1789, he appointed 4 different finance ministers: Calonne, Lomenie de Brienne, Necker, all tasked with solving the same impossible problem. You can't cut spending enough to matter without losing wars or provinces, and you can't raise taxes enough to matter without provoking revolt. Calonne tried to tax the nobility. The nobles refused. Brienne tried to restructure the debt. Creditors refused. By August 1788, the royal treasury literally ran out of money. Couldn't pay soldiers, couldn't pay pensions, couldn't pay bread subsidies to Paris. So Louis called the Estates General, the first meeting of the National Assembly in 175 years, to approve new taxes. We know what happened next. The Estates General became the National Assembly. The National Assembly became the Revolution. And on January 21st, 1793, Louis XVI was executed in the Place de la Révolution. Ask a historian what caused the French Revolution and you'll get a dozen answers. Enlightenment philosophy, social inequality, failed harvests. But there's one factor that doesn't get enough attention. All true. But here's the thing. The revolution happened when it did because France was bankrupt. The debt crisis forced Louis to call the Estates General, and once he did that, he lost control of the sequence of events. The debt didn't cause the revolution alone, but it opened the door. And once that door opened, there was no closing it. So let's step back. 3 empires, 3 debt spirals, same pattern. Spain, 105 years from first bankruptcy to irrelevance. The Ottomans, 27 years from first loan to foreign financial control. France, 15 years from American Revolution to regicide. And here's the mechanism that connects all 3. Debt enables military spending beyond current revenue. Military spending creates enemies or commitments that require more military spending. More spending requires more debt. Debt service grows faster than revenue. Eventually, debt service crowds out everything else: infrastructure, administration, even military spending. Weakness invites threats. Threats require borrowing. Except by now, creditors charge higher interest because you're desperate. Higher interest means higher debt service, and the spiral accelerates. Once debt service crosses 50% of revenue, you're not funding a state anymore. You're funding interest payments. And every empire that crossed that threshold either collapsed, lost sovereignty, or restructured through revolution. Spain tried 5 bankruptcies. Didn't work. Creditors just charged more next time. The Ottomans tried partial default. Didn't work. Creditors seized control instead. France tried reform. Didn't work. The political system broke before the financial system did. So here's the uncomfortable question. Can any empire escape a debt spiral once it begins? The historical record says, almost never. Not through austerity, because cutting spending weakens you militarily. Not through growth, because debt grows faster than the economy when interest rates are high. Not through inflation, because creditors adjust rates or refuse to lend. The only exits are default, revolution, or conquest by someone else who assumes the debt. All of which destroy the empire in question. And now we need to talk about today, because this isn't just history. As of 2023, the United States federal debt stands at $31 trillion. Annual revenue, approximately $4.9 trillion. Annual debt service, $659 billion. That's 13.4% of revenue, not 50%, not yet. But interest rates are rising. The Congressional Budget Office projects that by 2033, debt service will reach $1.4 trillion annually, roughly 20% of revenue at current projections. And if interest rates stay elevated, that percentage grows faster. Japan's debt-to-GDP ratio is 264%. Italy, 144%. Greece already went through a debt crisis in 2010 that required European intervention. Modern economies have tools empires didn't: central banks, fiat currency, international financial institutions. But they also have something empires didn't: compound interest on debt that never stops growing, and bond markets that can trigger crises in hours, not years. What can history teach us today? That debt isn't the problem. Debt spirals are. That the richest empires still go bankrupt if spending grows faster than revenue. That there's a specific threshold where sustainable debt becomes terminal crisis, and that once you cross it, there's no gentle way back. Spain's silver couldn't save them. Ottoman trade routes couldn't save them. French agriculture couldn't save them. Because the problem was never revenue, it was spending, compounding interest, and the political inability to stop borrowing. So here's the reframe. Empires don't collapse because they're weak. They collapse because they're strong enough to keep borrowing long after they should have stopped. If this raises a question for you, and it should, it's this. What makes modern states think they can manage what Spain, the Ottomans, and France couldn't? We're examining that question in the next investigation, the infrastructure trap, and why empires can't afford to maintain what they built. Every collapse has a story. Let's investigate.